Marcel, you can click on the three dots. That will pull up the recording menu.
Yes, I went ahead and started it, Marcelo.
Okay, thank you, Preeti. Yeah, for some reason I don't have that on the dots. There's not an option for me to record. Maybe because I'm presenting, I don't know. But yeah, thanks. So what I wanted to do first, a couple of things. One is I have not prepared Azure update, services update. I just didn't have time, so I apologize. So I'll wait for Naveed when he's back to provide an overview of what's new that's coming on Azure. So what I wanted to do was to basically present one problem that I worked on for CBRE recently, and I thought it was interesting enough to talk about that. And of course, you'll see eventually this is just like a preliminary prototype. So I don't. I'm working with the customer to see how we can make it better and make it an official app for them. So basically, the problem I had was given was CBRE is real estate services, real estate management company, and they wanted to. They have these crews that go on the buildings, and what they do is they basically do equipment inventory, right? So they go to the equipment room on a building and look at all the AC units. They look at all the boiler or heating units, and they just take notes and enter that data into a system. So, or multiple systems. And also, you have to remember this CBRE is actually a global company, so it's all over the globe on many, I think, over 100 countries today. So every time they do this exercise, someone basically they have two people. One person goes in and reads off the nameplates, which look like this. Let me show you a couple. There's things that look like this, right, on equipments. And someone reads off the model number, serial number, manufacturer, and some other data, and someone takes notes manually, and then eventually they go back to the office and they manually enter that, type that into a system. So the idea was, okay, can we do something about it that eliminates the need for two people to be there, right? So the vision was, can I have a person come in with a phone or a tablet and go take a picture, and the app looks at this and says, okay, here's the serial number, model number, blah, 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 and uploads that data to a system automatically. So that was the vision. Actually, that is the vision still. So what we did was, okay, let's go ahead and, so I think the account team and Pablo, one of the CSAs in the AI, they created a demo to showcase, oh, yeah, we can use the OCR in cognitive services that basically scans text out of pictures and gets you the data. So, but then all we got was, the prototype was, yes, that's possible. Here's a list of all the data, all the text that you can get out of this picture, but there's some logic that has to be done to kind of figure out what is what, basically. So what I did eventually, so I took down actually take a step back. So I took on that problem, and first I wanted to make sure that the OCR API was the right one to use. So I did some testing, and initially it was like, okay, we should use the Forms Recognizer API, right? So if you go Forms Recognizer, this one. So if you're not familiar with cognitive services, there is this tool. It's in public preview now that basically allows you to go in and scan forms and allows you to get key value pairs. So from an API perspective, this was really good, right? So if I'm looking at this image, I do want to get key value pairs. I want to get this model number and then as a key, and then this is a value, right? So that was my first option to do that. So the way this API works, I wonder why I can't get to the documentation. So what happened when I tried to do that was, yeah, this one. So what happened when I tried to do that was a couple of things that I noticed. One is that you have to train a model with the forms that basically is a series of examples, and you train the model to recognize that specific form. So that is okay, but the thing, what I found was, and I'll show you here. So basically the problem was, okay, I need to train the model before. So if you think about how many manufacturers you have, right? So then you need multiple models for this. So I could not find a way to train a single model with multiple nameplates from multiple manufacturers because they look very different from each other. Even a single manufacturer looks different depending on how old the equipment is. So that was one of the things we considered. The next one was the API was slower. So for some reason, I mean, not counting the training time, every time you sent a request to analyze a specific image, it'll take several seconds to 30 seconds usually. So that was really slow. From, if you think about a person taking a picture on a phone and waiting 30 to 45 seconds for something to come back, that's not really could be used, but kind of defeats the purpose, right? So we want to have something that has less than 10 seconds usually, and as a response time. But the worst thing I think that killed it for me was this: the key value pair detection was not really accurate. So it only allowed me to train using 15 images. I don't know if that limit was raised after the private preview, when it became public preview. But what I found was several of the key value pairs were really not accurate at all. So the data that was expecting to make things a lot easier didn't actually materialize, unfortunately. So that said, I was like, okay, let's go and look at the OCR scan. So this is the one that was prototyped to CBRE. This is just another API, Cognitive Services. What I liked about that was really fast API calls. So like 2-3 seconds, you get something back fairly fast, and it scans all the text. That was really good, and no need to train the models. So no model to be trained. Just say, hey, analyze this image. It's there. Another thing I liked was, because the customer is using Power Apps to prototype this, there was already a connector to the OCR API out of the box, so they don't need to do anything weird. So the cons is, unfortunately, that was the lowest accuracy for scan text. You see here, for example, like this image is a good example where the OCR API didn't even recognize the Linux string here, this text, while the other one that I ended up using called text recognizer, I believe is called read now, or was upgraded to be named or renamed to read. That was able to recognize this fairly fast, so fairly accurately, I guess. Same thing for, like, when you look at the actual data, right? It took one for I on the OCR, and this other one actually read one correctly. So what it ended up using was the text recognizer API. The reason was most accurate text and data structure, And of course, again, I don't need to train anything. I just call the API and get the results back. Fairly fast, not as fast as OCR, but not as slow as the other one. The only thing that was a drawback was it's a two-step API call. So instead of OCR, like you say, get me analyze this image and you get back some results. This one is like you make a request, say I need to analyze this image, and that request is queued up. And then you call another API to say, is that done yet? And if it's not done yet, you have to do another call after X amount of seconds. Then you get that back in. So on my testing, I have not found anything that goes over 5 seconds. Sometimes, depending on the load, it takes 10 seconds, but most of the time I get sub 5-second response. So, which is good. So I'll pause for a minute. Any questions so far on this before I jump into showing the code? I'll take silence as no. All right, so this is what the application looks like. So let's go back and take a look at this. So we did, I created a Power App. So if you're not familiar with Power Apps, it's a way for you in Office 365 to create very easily create something that can be used on the web, on tablet or a phone. And it is basically data driven. So you tie the fields to data sources and basically allows a non-developer person to create something fairly quickly based on a data source, right? So if you're a business analyst and you want to showcase something in SharePoint, for example, you just create an app, say this list or this field or these text fields or everything else, they come from this SharePoint list, and all the plumbing behind the scenes is done for you automatically. Now, if you're a developer like myself, I felt like I was hamstrung. So like, okay, I want to do more stuff and I can't. So, but eventually I was able to come up with something that we could show. So if you look at this, it's fairly simple, right? I have a text box that where you enter a URL to the image that to be analyzed. There's a button you click to say, yes, analyze this image. And all it does, if you look at the code behind that, all it does is sets the URL, and you're going to see that in a bit, so why I do that. But sets the URL to a variable to the value of the text box, and sets this response variable to whatever is the result of this call. So this, what I'm doing here, I'm running a flow called call recognizer function with this value. So the flow has the logic to analyze this, right? And once I get that back, I show the image. This is an image preview control. And what I do here, I say, get the image to show here comes from this variable. So when I click here, I set this content to this variable, then it displays here. So now let's take a look at that flow. So when I look at the flow behind, because in Power Apps, you can do basic logic, but you can't do really code, like programming, I would say. All right, so why my flow is not showing? There you go. So on the flow, I have to do some logic processing, right? So what you have to do basically is to call the API, right? Get that URL, call the API, handle the retry logic to make sure when is the image ready. And once the image ready, you have to basically go over the data back that you get back and analyze the data, right? So try to find where the manufacturer string is, where the model numbers are, etc. So initially my thought was, okay, I'm doing this for a set of non-developer people. So I tried to do everything in the single flow. So what I found out was two things. So that made me use functions, and you see in a bit where the function is code is going to be. But what I found initially was this was going to be so complicated to implement in the flow that eventually it'll not be it'll be horrible for the non-developer to maintain that flow. So my original, I don't think I have the original ones before, but it'll be like several pages long and had if then branching on conditions and loops, while loops. So it eventually became too cumbersome and too slow. So every time I call this process, it'll take like a minute and a half to come back with something. So I said, you know what, this is not going to be useful. Not going to be able. They're not going to be able to maintain this properly, and they're not going to be able to correctly, or the performance is not going to work either. So instead of what I did was I said, you know what, I'm going to make this a function. So all I do on my flow here is basically say take whatever the URL that comes that I pass from the Power App. I put that in the body to say here's the image URL field that I need, and I call this function. And the function is going to get a result, and I just pass that along to Power Apps. So very simple flow. That doesn't do much, actually. So one of the things I was thinking was, well, actually, let me talk about that in the next steps for this. But what I'm going to show is eventually that you don't need to have this. You can go directly from Power Apps to functions using data sources. But unfortunately, I could not make, I got so many error messages or some configuration issue that's going on that I was not able to do it. So that's why I kept this. So let's take a look at the function real quick. I just need to have to find where my, open the portal here. So I created a function called nameplate recognizer function app. It has only one method, one service, which is the nameplate recognizer. And all it does, maybe I should open, oh yeah, I think you guys can see it correctly. So first thing you're gonna see is, hey, why are you using PowerShell and not C# or Python or something else, right? Well, the reason for that is when I was testing this to see what APIs were going to be the best, I just used PowerShell to prototype it because I thought it was quicker for me to just invoke the APIs directly from the command line and store the JSON results and kind of go through that and kind of do some queries directly on the JSON stuff. So I ended up having some code already done in PowerShell, and I said, you know what, instead of having me rewrite this in C# to look good, I'm just going to post this as a PowerShell function. So on functions, runtime, V2 runtime, you can have PowerShell functions as well. So I said, well, that's great. I'm just going to publish this as a function. So that's what I did. However, that posed a problem to me because remember when I said I wanted to just go directly from Power Apps to call function? Well, that doesn't work for PowerShell functions for some reason. But that's why I kept the workflow. But anyway, what this code does, you're going to see here is, doesn't have any magical code here. So just make sure, I have to clean that up. So what I do here is just go and do a couple of things. I call recognize text method, say here's the blob, where the blob is, or the URL to the image that has to be recognized. Then I get the results of that operation, convert that to JSON, And once that, when I called some functions to extract that data, and I just returned that data. So if you look at the way the API works, here's the method that calls the request or creates the request for the API. All I do is call the vision API, v2, and the recognize text method. I say this is a printed. You can do, I think, printed or ink. I believe that those are the options. Pass my cognitive services key, and I'm going to use JSON app body, and I just pass, okay, here's the URL to the image. And what I get in return is the operation location. So this is the URL that I have to use to get the results back. So when I call okay, get me the results, that's when you have to call it and say if you get something like it's running or not started yet, then you have to wait and call this back. You get a succeeded status once that is fully done. And once you get that succeeded status, you just use whatever the response is that will contain the data structure that has all the text. So once I do that, I go back and extract the data. So let me go back to where the extracted data is. So you're going to see this thing first. So what I do here is basically when you get the data back in JSON format, the text is inside boxes. So if you visualize, for example, an image, specific image, right, you're going to have boxes around the text, and these boxes are sorted in a specific way by the API. However, that sort algorithm doesn't sort the closest, it doesn't sort in the proper vertical distance. I don't know exactly why that is. So I found better results if I made the sort myself, sorting by the Y coordinate. So that's what I did here. So once I go there, I go and extract the manufacturer data. All it does is I just look for a specific list of manufacturers. That was the easiest way for me to, so I got some data, image samples from the customer, put all of them here and make sure they all match. If I found a string that matched any of these, that'll declare this is the manufacturer of that equipment. So and I need to extract model number and serial number. So what I ended up doing here was to basically say, depending on the manufacturer, I have some specific regex values that I want to look at and some cleanup regex values. So once I found something, I make sure that I remove extra stuff that is in that box that was scanned. This was done from trial and error and approximations. So I did for 1, 2, 3, 4. I think all these were in the sample. And if I don't find that specific manufacturer in the list, I just use the default regex, basically. So I did try to do to find a regex that covered all different ways manufacturers do model numbers. That became almost impossible, or actually pretty impossible to do, because even a single manufacturer had different naming conventions throughout the years. And I just could not find a good way to say, okay, here's a regex that can tell this is a Lennox or this is a train model number or serial number. So once I get that data, of course, I put that in an object and send that back in a HTTP response for this function. One of the things I did though was I did some crude logic on if I can't really get a specific pattern. What I do is I send the closest values to that specific find. So if I find a model string, but the other one, the next string is like just less than 6 characters. And what I do is, okay, I don't know what this is a true model number or not, so I send the adjacent values on the adjacent boxes. So that way, what happens is they get some options. So eventually, what is going to happen is a human is going to be needed here to make the final decision. So when we go in and let's say we copy this image link and they want to analyze this, what will happen is if you get more than one value here for number or model number, serial number, they're just gonna click, okay, this is the one I want. So in this case, it was fairly easy for the logic to kind of come up with what it is. But if I think I have, let me show you one that is not as accurate. This one is a good one. I think this we're not even gonna find. Yeah, so in this case, for example, yeah, it did find allegiance 11, which is good. It found MOD here, but it didn't exclude this guy. So a human eventually will have to come back here and say, okay, this is extra stuff, and I don't need volts, right? And for the serial number, same thing, right? They visually check, yeah, that was correct. I just take this out, and then they submit that to the target system. So any questions so far? We're right at the 30-minute mark, so I just want to make sure I can finish on time. All right, so the next steps for this, what you're going to do is you're going to present this to the customer, and we're going to go ahead and, of course, add like, what do we do with this data? Target, send that up to a specific system. You're going to test this with multiple manufacturers in multiple real world scenarios for images. And we also going to add camera, so that way we can run this out of phone. So this canvas here is the size for an iPad, not the mini, the big one. So eventually I want to have to also resize this to make sure it fits into a phone. That way we can go ahead on the field and actually test it. So this is all I have. Any questions? If you don't have any questions right now, that's fine. You just feel free to reach out to me if you want to look at this, or if you have any other additional questions, or whether we can leverage this somewhere else. All right, everybody's quiet. All right, so thanks everybody. Whoever, Preeti, I think you have the recording, so just let me